springtime here in the Alexander Valley of Sonoma, and here on the Jordan property, we're literally watching life unfold in front of us. It's a time when all the fruit trees begin to blossom, there's animals running around the vineyards, there's ducks learning how to swim in our ponds, but for the vines, it's time for bud break. Bud break is a signal that the new vintage is beginning. Now, not all of our grape varieties go through bud break at the same time. Our Chardonnay is going to break first, typically around mid to late March, Cabernet Sauvignon being the last grape to go through bud break, and that's typically going to happen up to 3 weeks later. So what triggers the onset of bud break? It's quite simple. Throughout the winter, it's not worth the vine's energy to stay green. There's simply not enough hours of sunshine and the temperatures aren't high enough. But as spring progresses and both of those begin to rise, that's a perfect signal for the vine to begin the new vintage. Often in wine country at this time of the year, the word bud break is just thrown out loosely, but it's a little more complex than that. There's actually a couple different parts to bud break. There's the early bud break, and that's simply when the buds push and start to unfold. And that's just it's a transformation of energy source. So during the winter, as the vine is dormant, all the energy that was created last year through photosynthesis is kept down into the older parts of the wood, the trunk, the roots. And then as that starts to come up in spring now, those leaves are going to expand, and that photosynthesis will again start to take place this year. And as that transformation takes place, you're going to see this really rapid growth, and that's actually termed rapid shoot development. Although springtime is a very exciting moment for us here on the property, it's also a very risky time of the year. Although springtime temperatures are increasing, the nighttime temperatures are still getting quite cold, and that can be dangerous for those newly exposed buds on the vines. If those go below 32 degrees, that's it. We're probably going to lose that bud. So it's important for us to keep track of what's going on in the vineyards. If you were to visit wine country, you're going to see a couple of things that may seem a little bit weird, but they're all for the purposes of watching out for this frost. And those are the big fans that you see throughout the vineyards. And basically what those are doing is stirring up an immersion layer. The cold temperatures are going to want to sink to the bottom, getting around to that level of the bud. But by stirring that warmer air up underneath it, we can prevent that from happening. Another thing is sprinkler systems. So what we can do is if we see those temperatures starting to drop, we turn on the sprinkler systems and keep those going throughout the night. And as long as you get that ice shell around the bud, nothing inside of that will go below 32 degrees. The third thing is our cover crops. Now, we planted cover crops for a few different reasons. One of them, perhaps on our hillsides, was for erosion control. We planted grasses, we planted oats. Another thing that we planted cover crops for was for bringing in natural predators. So we planted specific flowers, and those will combat against the nasty insects that could harm our vines. If you were to visit the property now, you'd see us mowing down a lot of these cover crops. And we do that for multiple reasons. We do it to deliver organic matter back into the soils for the health of the vines. We do it to balance the water. We don't want to give the vines too much. We don't want them to be too vigorous. So we may use those cover crops to compete for some of that water. However, if it's a drier spring, we're going to mow some of those cover crops down so that the vines can be a little bit more vegetative. This is also a time of the year where frost is a big scare. Nighttime temperatures can still get quite cold. And as that cold air settles to the ground, if there's cover crops, it's going to stop right around at the level of those, which could be at a similar level to the buds on the vine. So we'll mow those cover crops down so that cold air can drop down a little bit further, allowing that warmer layer to sit around the bud zone, preventing them from dropping below 32 degrees. The majority of the rainfall that we get occurs during winter and early spring, and that's perfect. That's what makes us such a prime viticultural region. Now, as spring continues, that precipitation is going to begin to taper off, and hopefully just in time for spring flowering. And that's a very important moment we don't want to get rain during that time, as those flowers will be very delicate, and we don't want to interrupt that process. Every single one of those flowers has the potential to become a grape berry. So during that time, if we were to experience any kind of heavy rains, heavy winds, adverse temperatures, that could be threatening to the development of that cluster, and we want our clusters to be as full and beautiful as possible. One of the primary tasks during the winter that our crews did was they came through and they pruned the vines. And for the most part, especially with our bilateral cordons, they pruned it down to a 2-bud spur. And so that's what's going to become this year's 2 canes. The thing with the grapevines though is that there's going to be other buds that continue to pop up. There's going to be buds down towards the bottom, those we'll call suckers, and there'll also be many more buds branching out on the cordons, which we'll call water sprouts. Suckering is simply a process of looking at the vine and deciding what wasn't intended to grow this year. So why is suckering important? It's important because we want a specific yield out of this vine. We don't want to just let it grow randomly wherever it will, and it will if we let it. So we specifically want to have just 2 canes coming off of this, and each of those canes will yield roughly 2 clusters. It's a minimal quantity of fruit, which is going to bring that maximum quality to the glass. So by taking off anything that wasn't meant to be growing, is just going to allow for all that energy to go into the buds that were intended to be part of this vintage. As I'm suckering, you can see how delicate these buds are, and that's, even though I'm going to be pulling these off, that ease is scary when it comes to thinking about the actual buds that are intended to grow as part of this year's vintage. Any kind of heavy wind, any kind of hail, adverse weather could cause those to pop off just as easy as I did with that one. All these transitions happen very quickly. We saw winter turn into spring, and now spring is going to turn into summer right before our eyes. And the beautiful green hillsides with all the colors are going to start to turn a lovely golden brown. And that's when the stressful conditions of this area are really going to start to show. It's not an area where other crops do well in, but for vines it's absolutely perfect. Jordan winemaker Rob Davis often says that harvest is a mirror of the spring, and that couldn't be more true. Everything that happens now is defining for what happens later on in the season. And so making sure that we're not attacked by frost, making sure that we're not attacked by insects, getting a uniform bud break and even growing is absolutely important to the quality and quantity of the wine that we're going to have this season.